Welcome back to Math 103. This is video clip number 11 on voting. Last time, we were looking at an election held using the instant runoff voting method. We found at the time that Claire wins this election under instant runoff voting. But then we said that suppose that wasn't the real election, that election number 2 here is the real election. So this was just, for example, a poll, but the actual election as such has a slightly different preference table. Namely, these three voters push Claire higher on their ballot. They end up pushing Anne lower. Every other ballot entry remains the same. So what happens when we now apply the instant runoff voting method to the new election? Well, now, in the first round, it is Anne who is eliminated first. It is Anne who has fewest first choice votes. So now Bob moves up on these 14 ballots right here, and we find that Bob now has a total of 30 first choice votes against Claire's 20, so Bob now wins the re-votes. That is very bad news from the point of view of the monotonicity criterion, because Claire should have remained the winner according to the monotonicity criterion. Claire won the first election. All the ballot changes were in her favor. No one else benefited from any ballot changes. No one pushed Claire lower on any ballots. The only ballot changes favored Claire, and yet she failed to remain the winner. She lost the re-vote. We find, therefore, that in this particular election and re-vote, the instant runoff voting method violates the monotonicity criterion. We're not saying this always happens, but in this particular election and re-vote it happened. The conclusion, then, is that the instant runoff voting method sometimes violates the monotonicity criterion. As much sense as the monotonicity criterion made, as irrational as it seemed that any sensible voting method could ever violate it, we find that something which actually makes quite good sense, most of the time, the instant runoff voting method, it does sometimes violate this criterion. Okay, so what does that mean in practical terms? So that means that if you hold an election, followed by a re-vote, and you're using the instant runoff voting method to determine your winner, there is a real possibility, you have to go into that scenario worried that there is some possibility that the results will violate the monotonicity criterion. Such a violation is possible. Some of the time, it does happen. Okay. But to be clear, there are many, many elections and re-votes in which no such violations occur, and in practice, such violations are fairly rare. Does the monotonicity criterion only tell us about scenarios where there is an initial election followed by a second election, a re-vote? Well, that's the way we've set it up. That is the narrative that we have used to explain it. But in fact, there's a way of thinking about it so that it is relevant even to a single election. So here's the single election narrative. We hold just one election, but as election day approaches, the three voters in that rightmost column of the preference table are uncertain whether they're going to rank Claire first and Anne second, or Anne first and Claire second. What does that tell us? It means that if Claire knew everyone's preferences going into the election, and knew that those three voters had that uncertainty, then what would she do? She would be in the position of going to those three voters and saying, please, don't vote for me in first choice. Put Anne ahead of me. Leave well enough alone. She's hoping that they're going to do that. What she hopes they won't do is, God forbid, put her in first choice, because then she would lose the election. Okay. Phrasing it that way not only expresses this scenario in terms of one election, where there's case 1 versus case 2 as to how those voters are actually going to vote on election day. Now they're uncertain, but they're going to choose one way or the other. When you phrase it that way, it makes clear how this makes sense for a single election, and also why it's so irrational that Claire should have to worry in this way and try to persuade voters not to support her too strongly, so that she can win. One of the tricky things about the monotonicity criterion is understanding the exact circumstances in which it applies or doesn't apply. Before going on to the next video, consider this same example one more time. An election is held using the instant runoff voting method. This is the original preference table. This is the preference table for election number 1. We already know from our earlier work that Claire is going to be the winner in election number 1. And now suppose that for whatever reason there is a revote, and in the revote the new preference table is what's given here. This is not the same as in the example we did on the previous slides. This revised election number 2 preference table is a different election number 2 preference table than we'd seen before. So stare at it a little bit and see how this preference table differs from the original one, and consider, do the results violate the monotonicity criterion, and how can you tell? Please answer this before going on.